Thank you for joining us for our annual video series from the International Symposium on Human Identification. We're in our 33rd year this year, and we are very honored to have Suni Edson with us today. Suni, hi, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
I am doing very well.
Excellent.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work? I would think it's very interesting to work with the Armed Forces Division.
Yeah, I work for the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. We're part of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. And so what we do is my group, which is the past accounting group, is tasked with the identification of missing soldiers from past military conflicts. And so we do DNA testing, and we're partners, mission partners, with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. And so they're the anthropologists and the archaeologists, and we're the lab people doing DNA work.
Wow, that has to be fascinating. I think you're speaking during this conference about World War II and the
Yes.
identification of, is it missing in action or?
Yes, I'm speaking on Thursday about a very particular incident, which is the Cabanatuan Prison Camp, which is located in the Philippines and is an estimated 2,736 individuals in a single prison camp. And so for World War II, we currently have over 88,000 individuals are still listed as missing and unidentified. So what we focus on is we do World War II. We also work on Korean War losses, and that is fewer. We're down to about 8,000 missing and unidentified. And we also work on Vietnam era losses. And so we and DPAA are tasked with anyone who is declared missing and unidentified from any kind of U.S. military conflict.
Wow, those numbers are staggering. How does the process work?
Well, a lot of times right now we're doing, the DPAA anthropologists go out and they'll do recoveries from crash sites. So anytime they gather all kinds of intelligence about where people might have gone missing. So crash sites, airplane crashes, ships that have sunk, any kind of area where they know somebody might have gone missing. But they're also big into looking at cemeteries where unknowns might have been buried. And so for World War II, they're going to local cemeteries where perhaps local individuals have said, we buried the remains of a plane crash here, or battlefield losses where they know individuals might have been buried. And they'll go out and disinter them and do all the anthropological and archaeological evidence work on it, and then provide samples to us for DNA testing. In Vietnam and Korea, it's a similar process. But in Korea, we have partner agencies, and they work with the what's called MACRI, which is the South Korean identification efforts. And so they have their own anthropology lab. They're also a military branch and help our anthropologists do recoveries. And in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, they also have partner agencies that they work with to do recoveries. And so it's a worldwide mission. They're out all the time doing recoveries everywhere. And so Cabanatuan Prison Camp, what I'm speaking on Thursday, is a disinterment project that they did in the Manilla American Cemetery. And so the remains were recovered from the prison camp cemetery in the 1950s and transported to that location and buried as unknowns there. And so since they're able to go out and hopefully we can identify people from that now. And so that's become one of our big projects that we're working on. It will be the largest single project that we've worked on.
Oh, that is incredible. It does sound like an enormous project, so that makes sense. What does a day in the life look like for you, given that?
For me, I unfortunately don't get to do any bench work anymore. So I do a lot of case review, technical work, going through all of the reports that people have generated and tabulating the data. So this is a project I work on. It's my management project. So as we get DNA results in, I organize them, see if they're shared between any of the DNA samples that we've tested, see if they match anyone we have in our family reference database, and provide that information back to the lead anthropologist in Hawaii.
Wow, that is amazing. It's almost hard for me to wrap my head around. You must have so many cases to review.
Yeah.
How did this project come about initially?
Originally I think, well, for this project itself was at the time of the loss. So I'm going to tell a little bit of the history of it. At the time of the loss, while the prisoners were in the prison camp, they were afforded the opportunity to take records of who was buried in each location. So there are over 1,100 graves associated with this particular incident. But in the 3 years the prison camp was open, that was almost 3,000 individuals who died. The prisoners were allowed to keep records and keep a cemetery for themselves. But so what they did was they placed their identification within their person, so either put it on their body, or in the instance where they'd had their identification media removed, they wrote notes about the person. And so they had very detailed records. So when American Graves Registry came in, when the camp was liberated, they were able to get those records and map the cemetery. So technically, everybody there is identifiable, but they disinterred them and moved them into Manilla and buried them as unknowns. Because at the time, with the anthropology, and we're still in the middle of a war in 1945, and still dealing with the war in Europe, the war in Asia, there were so many other things going on. You're dealing with the fallout from Pearl Harbor still, and all of the individuals who were lost there. And so this became, the families came to us in the early 2000s and said, we think we know who should be in these graves. So they're technically identifiable, and according to our mandate and the mandate for DPAA, we needed to go out and see if we could actually do that. So this started as a simple project. We just exhumed one grave and tried to identify the 14 individuals who were supposed to be in that particular grave. And given that we had a decent amount of success with that one, we decided that this needed to go on and be a complete project and continue to exhume the rest of the graves associated and try to identify everybody who is present and not just one. Because if you say, well, I'm able to do one, why didn't you do the rest of them? And we owe it to the families to provide them that kind of information.
That is a wonderful history to help frame it, and working with the families. And also, was it usual for prisoners to be able to keep a record like that, where it started before they were moved to unknowns?
Sometimes it depends on the camp.
Okay.
And this was just very particular in that once it started, prisoners left because they were being transported for work details. But the Philippines are in the middle of the ocean, and so they didn't add to this very much. And you had people there who were there for an extended period of time, and therefore were able to work with the captors and make it so that they could keep records and gain their trust and understanding, so that they were able to make record of what was going on.
Okay. That's very interesting. That's something I didn't know, that I hadn't heard of. So the work you're doing, obviously there's an incredible mission to do this for the families. It can't be easy, though, when you're disinterring. There must be some co-mingled samples, challenges that you're facing. What does that look like?
Well, it's been a big challenge for us, because when they were buried together. They were buried together in a common grave. So each day, so the individuals weren't buried separately. They were buried together in a common grave for the day. And so everybody who passed within that 24 hours were buried in a single grave together. And so when American Graves Registry went in, it's very hard to keep people separate. You are faced with a very small group of people trying to disinter the remains of almost 3,000 people and transport them to another location. So there is extensive commingling. And so one of the things that we do in large mass scale fatality events like this, and especially for World War II, is individuals were placed in a bundle together and then placed in a coffin. And so they believed it to be a single group of people or a single person. And so that they weren't always right. And it's through no fault of their own. They were doing the best they could in very hard circumstances. And so that's our job now, is to try to untangle that and reassociate the remains together and return an intact person to their family. And so there's a lot of commingling in that instance, and sometimes it's just small elements such as finger bones, and mostly not large elements, because the anthropologists are able to reassociate the longer fragments together, intact fragments together. And they use all kinds of techniques such as measurements, examination, whether or not the weights are balanced between itself. There's a lot of different, I always like to say, well, DNA solves everything, but of course, there's a lot of different parts that go into it. And the anthropologists use a whole series of different measurements to reassociate remains together, and then give us the opportunity to say, yes, it matches this family member.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of different moving pieces that go into it.
What an amazing chain of highly skilled professionals, to do this piece by piece to arrive at an answer.
It's a lot of moving parts.
Absolutely, absolutely. Where are you at in the process? What will you be sharing during your presentation?
Well, I'm going to start and talk about how it was unexpected for us. Because we kind of started off with the whole process of, this is something we should be able to do. We were using a DNA extraction technique where it didn't matter which element in the body that we sampled from, which skeletal element we sampled from. Almost everything worked. It was about a 95% success rate. And so when we come into this, we go, well, we shouldn't have a problem. And then it turns out that there was so much more going on that we didn't anticipate, that became a little bit of a challenge. For instance, when you put a cemetery in the middle of a city, there's all the concrete and asphalt. And so water does not drain appropriately. And Manilla has over 80 inches of rain a year. And I say that, and people go, well, that doesn't seem like that's that much. And then you go, well, Seattle, which everybody says is rainy, gets 37 inches of rain a year, 37. And so the water table was a huge challenge for us. And so the lead anthropologist, Mary Megacy, and I are working on trying to figure out how this has either helped or hindered our process. But there's so much water there that you literally cannot lift the coffins without having them drained of water first. But one of the really interesting things that we found was the remains were treated with a formalin, with what they call a hardening compound, and it's to preserve them for transportation. And we didn't expect this to be an issue because we didn't know it had happened. Because typically this was only done when remains were being transported overseas. So we can only imagine that American Graves Registry anticipated that they were going to send the remains overseas. They didn't know they were just going to move them 100 miles and then bury them there. permanently. So they were treated with formalin powder. And what formalin does is formalin binds to proteins in DNA and prohibits them from being unzipped. So you get a lot of DNA out of the remains, but you can't do anything with it. And so so PCR, when PCR treats DNA, it unzips it. And what the formalin does is it binds into the protein and kind of, when you get your zipper stuck and it won't move and you're like, ah. So that's essentially what formalin does. It prohibits it from unzipping.
That is a great analogy for viewers who are watching this who aren't familiar with that. But wow, so now you have that. You can't unzip some
Right.
pieces of the DNA. You have degradation from water. You have transport. How do you overcome these challenges?
Very slowly. But I think, we have the real opportunity at our laboratory of being able to take the time and try to make things work. Because, we don't have the opportunity of saying no. And we can't, because our goal is to provide answers to the families and to return these service members home. And we don't have that option of saying no. We can't just say, well, it didn't work. We are really fortunate to have a group, our emerging technology section, and they take the time to figure out, like, well, this might work. This might be a solution. And I was really lucky to have two of our analysts who determined a modified method for our extractions to try to find other ways to work around the problems we were seeing. And then we also, at the beginning of the project was 2014, and we were just doing basic mitochondrial DNA analysis. But then we started with a process, which I'm sure other people have talked about, is next generation sequencing, or massively parallel sequencing, that allows us to look at very tiny pieces. And so, like I said, with the DNA being bound and you can't unzip it, well, there are pieces that break off, and there are the pieces in between that are free, and they call it free DNA. And so we have a process at our lab that's called a capture-based assay. And we literally go use different materials to go in and pluck out these pieces of free DNA and then reassemble them into a whole. And that's been part of how we've gotten around the issues, is because that way we can generate an entire mitochondrial DNA genome with things that we hadn't thought would previously work.
That is incredible. I mean, that sounds almost impossible. It's amazing what you're able to do by taking those pieces and reassembling them. The technology has come so far, and the work you're doing to, very finely bring this together. It's amazing that you're sharing this here. This is, that kind of leads to the next question. What advice would you give to other people who are, maybe working on projects that aren't exactly like yours, but are facing some of the same challenges?
Take the time to really try to figure out what happened. And one of the biggest things I like to say to people is, like, talk to your anthropologist. Like, as a DNA person, we often go, oh, it's DNA. We'll solve it. Don't talk to those people who go dig in the ground. But we do need to talk to everybody. We do need to really it's a collaborative effort. So we should build relationships with all the other labs that are building your picture. So DNA is just a piece of the puzzle. And so for human identification, take the time to really learn about the incident. And so, all the time we say, oh, everything, DNA should be done in the blind, so you shouldn't be biased. But I think when you're working in situations like this, where you have a mass fatality event, you have to talk to people. You have to talk to them and say, this isn't working. Do you know what happened? We didn't know they were formalin fixed. This happened to be a historian who stumbled across the records that said, hey, this is what the AGRS did. And we didn't know they were full of water until we talked to the anthropologist and says, we don't understand what's going on. Is this a problem? You know, what, is there anything about it that we should know? And she's like, oh, well, the coffins are full of water. Would that have been a problem? Yeah.
Something we need to know.
Yeah, it would have changed our approach. And so it's, if you can't talk to people and really find out, because that'll allow you to adjust your approach and give you more time to be successful in what you're trying to do, instead of just, I tested it, it didn't work, I'm going to move on. No, figure out why. I mean, we're all scientists. We should take a moment to figure out what happened.
That is excellent advice, and I feel like a theme from many of the interviews this year. It is about working with historians, anthropologists, knowing the story before it gets to the point where you are testing DNA. We've been seeing that over and over again, and I think for other people who are facing cases or who are new to the field, that is valuable advice. Yeah. And that's why we definitely have you here presenting. It's very clear. What is next for you, if you can share? Back to it, or
back to it? I will go back on Friday and go back to case review and continuing to assess the data that had come in the last month. So once a month, I sit down and take all the data that we've worked on in a month and analyze it into the organization and try to figure out, well, do we have new people? Do we have more pieces of other people who have already, we already have located, or the different profiles, and try to get organized on that. Because we are doing some limited short tandem repeat or STR testing on these remains as well. We're really hopeful to have in the next year or so SNP testing online for this, because that should be able to, and one of the things with World War II is you don't have references available. And so your references are not siblings or parents anymore, they're nieces, nephews, cousins. And so we're really hopeful to implement SNP testing, because that will allow us to use anybody in the family lineage as a reference.
That's really amazing when kinship can play a role and you have the ability to trace back without needing a direct descendant. That's incredible.
It's very exciting. It's such an exciting technology.
Yeah, that's incredible. Have you attended ISHI before?
I have.
Okay.
I have, and I love it. And it's always a meeting I really enjoy attending. It allows us to do all DNA all the time, but also to really do a lot of networking and meeting other people who can help provide information or guidance in the things that you're working on.
It's really a wonderful group, and I am so honored to be able to interview you this year and that you're presenting. Thank you for taking time out to share this with us.
Absolutely.
Not just the presentation, but also the video. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and thank you for taking the time to hear about what we're working on.
Yeah, it's incredibly interesting. I love the field. Thank you so much.